In this video, we'll take a look at pollution. We'll talk about point versus non-point pollution, and then we'll take a dive into water pollution, looking specifically at that type of pollution because humans tend to impact aquatic ecosystems more than really anything else. This is because humans have naturally settled around coastlines and rivers, and as a result, impact those ecosystems pretty much more than anything else. Pollution is when harmful substances contaminate an ecosystem. There are three main types of pollution: water, air, and land. And again, we're going to take a closer look at the water pollution in this video. In class, we're going to do a stations activity on air pollution. And during power hour, you're going to get to work with a little portion of land pollution. First, we're going to look at point versus non-point sources. It depends on whether or not you can track the source of pollution down to a single place or thing. Point pollution is the type of pollution that you can pinpoint to a distinct location. In other words, it's a specific factory that you know is producing pollution, or a specific sewer pipe that's leaking and contaminating a water supply. It can be pinpointed to a single location. That is point sources. Non-point sources come from many places over widespread large areas. Good example of this one is oil that's washed off the road from cars. As cars and trucks travel down the road, they will drip small amounts of oil onto the road. This is why when you're driving down the highway, you notice a dark line that runs down the center of each lane. That's where chemicals have dripped off of the engine and onto the road surface. Now, when it rains, the rain will pick some of that stuff up and wash it away. It is a non-point source because it happens all over the place. It happens on pretty much every well-traveled road. You can't pinpoint it to a single road. You can't pinpoint it to a single car. It is a non-point source because it happens over a large area. Like I said, we're going to take a close look at water pollution in the guided notes and in this video. In the lab, we'll go over and do some stations on air pollution so you can understand where that's coming from and what kind of impact that has on humans and the environment. And in class, we'll be doing some graphing activities with garbage and waste disposal, one of the big sources of our land pollution. There's lots of different types of water pollution. What we're going to do is just go through a bunch of different types, understand where they are and what they do. So nutrient pollution, we talked about this already when we were doing our nutrient cycles. It's when runoff washes too much phosphate, too much nitrate into a body of water. Phosphates and nitrates are two chemicals that plants and algae need to grow. If you have too much of these in the water, you can get an algae bloom. And as we learned during our nutrient cycle unit, when the algae blooms, it can use up all the oxygen in a body of water, cause eutrophication, which can lead to die off of any oxygen needing organism, like fish. We have toxic chemical pollution. This is when dangerous chemicals are released into bodies of water. These chemicals can be organic or inorganic, going back to our very first unit that we did. Organic are those that contain carbon and hydrogen. Lots of carbon bonds with mostly hydrogens and a few other things attached to it, or inorganic compounds, the things that don't contain those carbon and hydrogen bonds. I'm going to give you an example of one of each. An oil rig fire could cause massive amounts of oil to be released into the ocean. This is water pollution. This is release of a toxic chemical into the water. It's an example of an organic compound because oil is long carbon chains with mostly hydrogen and a few other things attached to it. Organic compounds can be toxic chemical pollutants. Oil is just one of them. There are others. An example of an inorganic pollutant, a toxic pollutant, is mercury. Mercury can be spilled. Mercury is used in some industrial processes. If you ever look at fluorescent light bulbs, it says right on them not to put them in trash cans, not to put them in landfills. because they do contain a small amount of mercury. So the places that are making these things obviously have to have a significant amount of mercury around, kept in storage tanks. And if any of those storage tanks were to rupture or spill, then we have a toxic chemical spill. It has to be cleaned up by the Environmental Protection Agency. Mercury is an inorganic substance, so an example of an inorganic toxic chemical that can cause pollution. Sediment pollution is something that's interesting to me because it's something that we don't think about. As we know from our previous part of this unit, the first set of guided notes was, the human population has mostly settled around water along the coast and along rivers. So when we settle on all these places in modern day life, that means we clear a lot of land and we build a lot of houses. When we clear land, that creates bare soil that when it rains will run off and wash into bodies of water. A lot of dirt and debris will run off with that water into the ocean, into the rivers, etc. A good example of this has happened around Florida, where coastal construction has increased the amount of erosion. This erosion dumps large amounts of dirt and sand into the ocean, and this sediment has settled on corals and killed most of the hard coral reefs in the Caribbean. This happens because coral is a mutualistic symbiosis. You have two organisms, an algae and a coral polyp, that live together and benefit each other. The algae photosynthesizes and gives food to the polyp. The polyp, with its stinging tentacles, provides protection for the algae. So it is a mutualistic symbiosis. When the sediment gets washed in the water, it will settle out in the coral reefs, and it will block those algae from getting the sunlight they need to produce food. Now, rather than just hanging out in the corals and dying, they'll actually leave the coral so they can get into the water where they can get the light they need to survive. While that allows the algae to survive, it's a death sentence for the polyp, the coral. The coral, without its photosynthetic algae, can no longer make enough food to survive, so the corals die. It's called bleaching. You can see it in the picture here. All those big white patches are corals that have died because of bleaching, because the algae have left them, and the polyps have simply died. The white you see there is the skeletal remains of those corals. Sediment pollution. Again, anytime we build near the coast, we're going to produce sediment pollution. We're going to talk a little bit more about nuclear power plants in our renewable, non-renewable energy unit. Thermal pollution occurs when warm water is introduced into a body of water like a lake or a river. It happens around nuclear power plants because they need a lot of water to keep their cooling systems cool. You'll see nuclear power plants are most often built next to rivers or lakes. They draw large amounts of water in from those lakes or rivers to cool their systems. There's 3 different water systems in a nuclear power plant. You have a set of water that flows around the reactor. That water keeps the reactor cool and provides heat to a second water system. In the second water system, water is boiled, turned into steam to run the turbines. The third water system comes in cooling that second one down. You have to take that steam, recondense it back into liquid water again so it can run through that system continuously. This outside third water system is where the lake or river water comes from. They draw cool water in from the lake or the river to recondense that water in the second system that runs the turbines. But at the same time, it makes this water warm. These things with the steam coming out of it are called cooling towers. Basically, that third water system, after it's done cooling down the second one, cascades down the inside of these cooling towers. And there are giant fans inside that push air through, blow cool air across it to cool it down much the same way you would cool down hot soup. You blow on it to get the soup cooler. Here we use giant fans to try to cool this hot water down a little bit. Thing is, it won't cool it down completely. It'll still be warm when it's released back into the lake or the river. Now, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not. In the wintertime, in the late fall, early spring, when the lake or river water is still really cold, this is really helpful for the fish that live there. The fish like the warm water. It keeps them active, keeps them feeding. Every fisherman that lives around a nuclear power plant knows in the late fall through early spring, you could go fish around the outlets from these nuclear power plants, and you're probably going to find a lot of fish there because the water's warmer there in the wintertime. The problem comes from when the water's already hot, like it is in the summertime. Hot water can't hold much oxygen. And because of that, you have hot water that's there already. You have even hotter water being introduced to it. That could raise the temperature of the lake or river water to the point where organisms start to die. The water gets so hot that there's not enough oxygen in it to support the living things that need that oxygen. So again, thermal pollution can be a good thing in the wintertime, can be a bad thing, particularly in the summer. We have biological pollution. This is when pathogens like bacteria and viruses get into the water. Pathogens or anything that can make us sick. This happens a lot of times because of feces. There are whole communities on the coast that don't allow dogs on the beach in the summertime because people don't clean up after the dogs like they should. And as a result, there ends up being a lot of dog feces around the water. And when that happens, the E. coli that's in the dog feces can get into the water and then make people sick. Happens a lot of times too whenever untreated sewage is released into a water system. Whenever there's huge storms and flooding, the water treatment plants can't handle all the water that's coming into them. So oftentimes they'll just have to let untreated waste go. And this will again introduce pathogens like E. coli into the water and potentially make it unsafe to drink. This is why oftentimes after a hurricane, after a flood, you have to boil water. You have a boil advisory in effect because some of these pathogens have made it into the water supply. Groundwater pollution is just like the name suggests. It's in the groundwater. Some contaminant gets into the soil and it gets washed down into the groundwater, which is unfortunate because as we learned in a prior unit, this is where most of our drinking water comes from. This happened in South Carolina as rocket fuel was spilled. During the Cold War, we were testing rockets and trying to develop new missile and rocket systems to keep the Russians at bay. Accidents happen, spills happen, and rocket fuel got spilled onto the ground. That rocket fuel got washed into the soil and is now contaminated drinking water supplies in several parts of South Carolina. There you have it. That's the water pollution side of things. Like I said, in the lab, you'll do some stations on air pollution, and during power hour, you do a little bit with the ground pollution, particularly from landfills.